When trauma becomes tradition, how 28 years later asks whether humanity can surviving the apocalypse. First, I'd like to start with one character, Spike. Spike is one of the first protagonists in a zombie movie who never actually experienced the apocalypse. He never watched cities collapse or society fall apart. He was born after all of that happened. Everything he knows about the world has been taught to him by people who spent their entire lives surviving the rage virus. I think that completely changes what this movie is trying to say. Most zombie movies ask, how do people survive the apocalypse? 28 years later asks a different question. What happens when an entire generation grows up after it? What happens when survival isn't temporary and fear becomes normal? By the end of the presentation, I want to argue that the real danger in 28 years later isn't the rage virus itself, but the danger is that after enough time, fear stops feeling like an emergency and slowly becomes a part of everyday life. The film shows how a crisis can reshape an entire culture until people living inside it can't even recognize the change. So instead of asking whether people can survive the apocalypse, I think this movie asks something more interesting. Can humanity survive surviving it? The first clue is actually in the title. 28 years isn't just telling us when the movie takes place, it's also telling us what kind of story we're watching. Think about the earlier films. 28 days after the outbreak, everyone is reacting. 28 weeks later, people are still adapting. But 28 years later means something completely different. Enough time has passed that people are no longer responding to the crisis, they're living in a whole new world. Spike has never seen schools, cities, grocery stores, or everyday life before the rage virus. He has no memory of the world his parents lost. That means everything he believes about adulthood, danger, family, and survival comes from people who have been traumatized for nearly 3 decades. The apocalypse has become something that can be inherited, and I think that's the turning point of the movie. Once fear can be inherited instead of witnessed, it starts changing from an event into a culture. So the question becomes, how does this happen? Fear hasn't disappeared, it's just invisible now. That's the difference. The rage virus didn't only change people's behavior, it also reshaped their culture. The four steps. Professor Murphy asked me what I actually meant when I said trauma becomes normalized. After thinking about it, I don't think that's quite the right way to describe it. I think the movie shows it happening in four stages. First, people repeat behaviors because they need to survive. Second, those behaviors become so common that nobody notices them anymore. Third, the behaviors harden into rituals and traditions. And finally, the the next generation inherits them without ever knowing where they came from. That's exactly what happens on Holy Island. Nobody wakes up thinking they're traumatized. The fears simply become the shape of ordinary life. Look at the crossing to the mainland. In a lot of cultures, a coming of age ritual marks the moment a child becomes an adult, a graduation ceremony, or a celebration that welcomes them into a safe, ordinary world that adults have built from them. On Holy Island, the rite of passage is the exact opposite. To become an adult here, you cross into the most dangerous place imaginable and you kill. The community has taken the structure of celebration, the build up, the send off, the pride when you make it back, and wrapped it around an act of violence. And notice how casually the adults treat all of this. Children learning archery feels normal. A successful hunt is something to celebrate. Parents don't agonize over teaching their kids to kill. They treat it as basic preparation, the way another parent might teach their child to swim. None of it feels strange anymore because everyone has lived that way for 28 years. Fear hasn't disappeared, it's just become invisible. That's the difference. The rage virus didn't only change people's behavior, it also reshaped their culture. I could also connect this to Severance. And when I started thinking about it was when Candace says something interesting about the Shen fever. Before anyone became infected, people were already living repetitive lives. Wake up, commute, work, go home, repeat. The fever doesn't invent zombie behavior, it exaggerates routines that already existed. I think 28 years later is doing almost the exact same thing. The only difference is instead of office routines, we have survival routines. Every morning, people prep for danger. Children train with bow and arrows. Adults patrol the island. Nobody questions why these routines exist, because they're simply parts of everyday life. That made me realize something. The real opposite of humanity isn't death, it's living without reflection. Both Severance and 28 Years Later suggest that people become metaphorical zombies when they stop asking why they live the way they do. Routine replaces thought, and that's exactly what happened on Holy Island. What trauma looks like to Jamie. The best example isn't the island, it's Jamie. I don't think Jamie is intentionally a bad father at the start. I think he's supposed to be someone genuinely thinking he's doing the right thing. Look at what he's teaching Spike. During Spike's first hunt, he encourages him to kill, telling that the more he does it, the easier it will get for him. At first, that sounds like simple survival advice, practical, even caring, the kind of thing a parent says to steady a nervous kid. But think about what it actually means. Jamie isn't really teaching Spike a skill, he's teaching him to feel less. The lesson underneath the lesson is that the way to handle something horrifying is to keep doing it until it stops affecting you. Spike was horrified in the moment, and he looked at his father like it wasn't even his own father for a moment too. This is Jamie's answer to fear, emotional distance. If killing becomes easier, if lying becomes easier, if grief becomes easier to ignore, then surviving becomes easier too. The problem is that the same numbness that keeps you alive also slowly erases the parts of you that made survival in the first place. You can see the exact same instinct when he lies to Spike about Isla's illness. He tells himself he's protecting his son, but he's really protecting himself. Telling the truth would mean facing the fear and grief he spent years pushing down. And Jamie has built his whole identity around not doing that. So instead of letting Spike grieve honestly, he hands down the suppression to him like an inheritance. Jamie isn't evil, but he is someone who's lived in trauma so long that he mistakes his emotional suppression for strength. And Spike mistakes it for adulthood because it's the only example he's ever known. That's what inherited trauma actually looks like. It doesn't look dramatic, it looks ordinary. It becomes a part of your everyday life, and you're stuck with it. Dr. Kelson breaks the pattern. Then Spike meets Dr. Kelson. I don't think it's an accident that Garland waits until halfway through the movie to introduce him. By that point, we've already accepted Jamie's worldview right along with Spike. Then Kelson quietly takes it apart. Instead of dividing the world into humans and monsters, he builds the Bone Temple from the remains of the infected and non-affected alike. Think about what that act actually is. The island survives by forgetting, by turning the dead into threats, and threats into routine. Nelson does the exact opposite. He gathers the dead, all of them, and arranges them with care. which means he has to stop and look at each one. The temple is a monument to remembering, built in the middle of a culture organized around not remembering. When Spike first sees the Bone Temple, he is just amazed by it, and you'd think he might be creeped out by it, but he actually admired its beauty. He reminds Spike that every skull belonged to someone who once laughed, loved, and thought. To Jamie, an infected person stopped being a person the moment they turned. To Kelson, they never stopped. Infection changed their body, but it didn't cancel the life that came before. Even surrounded entirely by the dead, he refuses to erase their humanity. That's the complete opposite of Jamie. Jamie believes survival requires emotional suppression. Kelson believes survival requires remembering what makes people human. The movie isn't arguing that survival is wrong. It's asking the harder question, what does survival cost? Holy Island stopped asking that years ago. Spike is finally beginning to ask it. Spike and Jimmy. The ending made me realize something I completely missed the first time I watched the movie. Spike and Jimmy actually begin in almost the exact same place. Both grew up during the apocalypse. Neither of them chose the world they were born into. Both lose the adults who were supposed to guide them through it, and both are left to make sense of something unbearable on their own. They inherit the trauma, the same fear, the broken world. On paper, they're the same story, and yet they end up as completely different people, which is exactly why I think the movie sets them side by side. If two characters start in the same place and become opposites, then the ending isn't decided by what happened to them. It's decided by what they did with it. Jimmy stays frozen in the moment that destroys his childhood. He never moves past it. Instead, he builds his entire adult identity on it, turning the worst thing that ever happened to him into the thing that he becomes. Jimmy is what happens when an inheritor never questions what he handed. He doesn't examine the fear or ask whether it has to define him. He just accepts it completely and doubles down. In a way, he's the last of my four stages taken to its extreme. The trauma has been absorbed so fully that he can't even recognize it as a trauma anymore. It's just who he is. Spike does the opposite. He starts asking why the world has handed him the work he has. He doesn't reject everything. He still loves his father. He still comes from the island, but he refuses to accept that this is the way things are. This also reminded me of Get Out. The horror there doesn't come from one villain, it comes from an entire system passed down from one generation to the next, until nobody inside it even thinks to question it. The danger isn't a single person, it's the inheritance itself. The way harmful beliefs get handed down as if they were perfectly normal. And Spike and Jimmy both inherit fear exactly that way. The difference is what they do with it. Jimmy embraces the system until he becomes it. Spike interprets it. And I think the question that the movie leaves us with, when society hands its trauma to the next generation, which response will win? The one that doubles down or the one that finally stops to ask why? To wrap this up, when I first watched 28 Years Later, I thought it was another movie about surviving zombies. After spending more time with it, I don't think that's what it even cares about at all. I think it's about how societies slowly change after living through disaster for so long that nobody remembers another way to live. It isn't about the monsters, it's about the habits, about routines, about the stories parents tell their children, and the traditions nobody questions anymore. because they've existed for 28 years. That's why I think the movie adds something new to zombie fiction. Most zombie stories ask whether humanity can survive the apocalypse. 28 years later asks whether humanity can survive surviving it. The rage virus may have started the apocalypse, but the film suggests that the most lasting infection was never biological, it was cultural. And unlike a virus, culture can pass from one generation to the next without realizing they've inherited it.